This is the study session on economics and the reading on international trade and capital flows. Let's get right to the LOSs. First one asks us to explain the differences between gross domestic product and gross national product. Now, the previous reading talked at length about GDP, and I put a formula there in the top box just to remind you. GDP is consumption and investment and government spending, and then the difference between the exports and the imports. So a good definition to remember for GDP, which was discussed in the previous reading, was it's the market value of goods and services during a specified period of time. So I want you to think of GDP as all the stuff that's produced inside of a country that has a market value. I mean, for example, suppose that all the businesses and all the governments in the United States, for some strange reason, got together and started manufacturing boots that can only be worn on the moon. And so they made however many boots they could make during the course of a period, but no one's going to be probably going to the moon anytime soon. So nobody would be buying those, whether inside of this country or outside of this country. So GDP would be probably zero. GNP, on the other hand, gross national product, is the market value of all production activities during a specified time. And that includes income from foreign sources. And so that's the big difference between GDP and GNP. What about benefits and costs of international trade? Let's look at some benefits first. High-priced exports and lower-priced imports. So think about what that means. If we're a firm and we're selling here inside of our country, and we look across our boundaries and note that we could sell that at a higher price to consumers in other countries, well, then we're going to go ahead and export. And that's a good thing. It's going to increase overall economic welfare if we can satisfy our domestic demand and then, of course, take part of our supply of that good and service and then sell it in another country, higher priced exports. And then just the opposite of that is that if there's lots and lots of competition, then we can compare the goods and services produced by countries throughout the world, and we can import those goods and services that have the lower price. So that combination, I mean, each one individually, but the combination is going to increase overall economic welfare. And of course, this doesn't occur unless there's international trade. There's a more efficient allocation of resources. Our domestic productivity increases with foreign innovation. Global competition improves productivity. Of course, if we have to compete with companies in other countries, that we're going to take a closer look at our P times Q, our revenues, and then our operating expenses, improving productivity. Of course, there's going to be an increase in the variety of goods. There's going to be an increase in competition that reduces any kind of power from a monopoly. And efficiency is encouraged when individual countries can specialize. Now, anybody that's been paying attention to the United States over the last couple of months and maybe even up to a year, we've heard about how this international trade has hurt U.S. domestic employment and probably increased income inequalities. And so this is a big cost. It's a concern that politicians are trying to address. Another cost is that oftentimes firms, when they are not as efficient as their foreign competitors, well, they liquidate or they're taken over by another company, and unemployment increases. Of course, there's more competition. How about the difference between comparative and absolute advantage? This is an important difference here. Absolute advantage is a theory developed all the way back by Adam Smith in 1776, in which a country should produce goods when it can do so at a lower cost than its trading partner. And Adam Smith did this. He developed this theory after watching mercantilism take over the world back then, because this was, pretty much the advent of shipping lanes and all sorts of stuff. So we're doing lots and lots of global trade, and some people thought it was a good thing, some people did not, and so Adam Smith developed this model. Now remember, his book was called The Wealth of Nations, and so he suggested that the wealth of nations depended on the goods available to consumers, and that every nation would be better off if they specialized according to this absolute advantage. So let me give you just a quick example. If a U.S. worker takes 2 hours to produce 1 bottle of wine, and a UK worker, it takes 3 hours to produce that same bottle of wine, then the US has an absolute advantage in wine manufacturing. On the other hand, if US takes 5 hours to produce 1 piece of cloth, and the UK worker takes 4 hours, then UK has the absolute advantage in cloth. Now, let's compare that to a comparative advantage theory, which was developed by this dude, David Ricardo, in the early 1800s. And he was trying to explain why exporting was beneficial to all trading partners. And it really is a piggyback on top of Adam Smith's theory, but it suggested that the absolute difference between the two costs was not nearly as important as the relative costs. And so countries ought to produce goods when they have a lower relative opportunity cost. So let me give you an example here. Suppose it takes a U.S. worker 5 hours to produce 1 unit of beer and 6 hours to produce a pair of shoes. If the UK worker takes 4.5 hours for the beer, same amount of beer, and 4 hours for the pair of shoes, then we can conclude that UK has the absolute advantage in both. 4.5 to 5 with the beer, 4 to 6 with the pair of shoes. Now here's the deal. If workers in the United States, they could spend a total of 11 hours, the 5 and the 6, 11 hours to produce the 1 unit of beer and 1 pair of shoes. In the UK, it would take just 8.5 hours to produce that same unit of beer and that same pair of shoes. Or, here's the key point of this, or a US worker could spend 11 hours and it would be able to produce 2.2 units of beer. And in the UK, the workers could spend 8.5 hours and they could produce 2 3/8 pair of shoes. And so notice what happens. Instead of just a total of 2 units of beer and 2 pair of shoes, we have 2.2 units of beer and 2.375 pairs of shoes. So therefore productivity increases and consumption increases. So that's the nature of comparative advantage, that one country specializes in one thing that it's relatively better at than another country. Now, the one part of this that might show up for you guys is that it's important to remember that labor is the only factor of production in both models. Here's a good example, multiple choice example of what we just described. Russia can produce 30 million liters of beer, 6 million liters of vodka. Ukraine, 35 million liters of beer and 21 million liters of vodka. So Ukraine clearly has the absolute advantage, right? So which of the following is accurate? Well, there's number I. Ukraine has an absolute advantage. So we know that one's correct. Ukraine has a comparative advantage in the production of beer. And so think about this. If you look at the two productions of beer, it's 30 versus 35 million. So although they're not identical, they're much closer together than the 6 million liters of vodka and the 21 million liters of vodka. So surely Ukraine is much better at producing the vodka than Russia is. So it makes sense to say something like, let's let Ukraine make the vodka, let's let Russia make the beer. And so I think that leads us to 1 and 3. Yeah, so Ukraine has the comparative advantage in the vodka, not the beer. All right, going back to that Ricardian model and the Heckscher-Ohlin model. So let's explain and the source of comparative advantage in each model. Countries without absolute advantages benefit from trade because they might have comparative advantages, as shown in those two previous examples. And so even though the model focuses on labor as the input, the comparative advantage is going to result from technology. And this circular flow of money between and even among trading partners guarantees that there will be an efficient flow of that capital from the country without the comparative advantage to the country with the comparative advantage. Now, this Heckscher-Ohlin model was developed, sometime after World War I. And the idea behind this was an observation that countries that had specific or have specific natural resources are probably really good at managing those natural resources, and that therefore they should trade with other countries that have different natural resources. For example, a country with oil reserves exports to a country with substantial gold and silver reserves. Of course, that makes sense. And so countries with farmland should import lots of labor-intensive goods. How about trade restrictions? So these are any kind of restriction that is instituted by the politicians in order to protect domestic producers from competition. And so there are, in general, 5 of these. A tariff is a fancy word for a tax. Those of you paying attention to the United States will know that President Trump has imposed a 25% tariff on steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum, among other things. Licenses, what this does is limit the ability to import. For example, Mexico requires import licenses for its companies to import eggs, wood, and furs from the United States. This is interesting, even though we have had NAFTA for years and years. Import quotas, restrictions on the amount. I did a little bit of research. Look at this. We have import quotas in the United States on peanuts, brooms, and olives. Voluntary export restraint. This is not too common these days, but back when I was in college, if you can go back that far, the Japanese companies agreed to limit their exports of automobiles to the U.S. under President Reagan. And in fact, this was such a disaster that, and I can't remember the exact dates, but I think this may have started in 1983 or 1984 and only lasted for a year or so. And then that was rescinded. And then local content requirements. This is a little bit more subtle. Mandated use of domestic inputs. Currently, the European Union is pressuring Netflix and Amazon to maintain a minimum of 20% European content. So that would promote Netflix and Amazon from going out, encouraging them to buy movies and TV shows that were made and produced in Europe. How about capital restrictions? This is a restriction of the flow of capital between and among countries. A great example of this was several years ago. The European Central Bank froze the Greece assets during this Greece debt crisis. You might remember that the country of Greece was nearing bankruptcy on its federal debt. The federal government of Greece responded by saying, okay, time out, we're done. So they closed its bank, installed these capital controls, which prevented any international monetary transfers. So essentially, this capital restriction just shut down trade, at least for a short time period. So this is used to protect domestic markets and industries. Of course, it can slow growth, and it can mean higher domestic prices. So remember the distinction there. Trade restrictions affect goods and services. Capital restrictions affect financial assets. How about trading blocks and common markets and economic unions? These are different names for organizations that get together and try to promote and protect economic development, at least on the domestic side. And so a trading bloc is just a number of nations that work together to protect themselves against unfair trade, against imports and non-members of the trading bloc. Common markets are those that agree to trade by not having any restrictions with one another. And then economic unions, and that's the European Union as well. So they have a common market. And I'll give you some examples of each of those there. What are the motivations and advantages? So motivations include things like new markets and sharing knowledge and available resources. Remember here in any kind of an economics discussion, we talk about scarce resources. And so some countries have more of a resource than the other. And then reducing future competition. Advantages include things like free trade, economies of scale, which we always talk about in economics, job creation, which you hear from the politicians all the time, and protection. How about common objectives of capital restrictions? Developing countries want to make sure that their producers are not acquired by foreigners. I think everybody's fairly aware that during the merger and acquisition game, even domestically, that there is a big fear of the loss of jobs. And so that's a political issue inside of a country. But of course, when it happens, when a foreign company is taking over a domestic company, and then there's a loss of jobs, that's an even more of an issue. Capital inflow can increase competition. Governments, they try to maintain control so that they know who owns the assets, and then they can make sure that the tax revenues are generated. Oh boy, these capital restrictions, what they are trying, the attempt is to try to manage capital flow so that the business cycle is not, highs and lows, the big booms and busts. And then another objective is so that there's some kind of equilibrium in the savings market, maintaining domestic ownership in local companies. How about the balance of payments? Just think about the balance of payments as kind of the government's balance sheet, and it includes the current account and the financial account and the capital account. Current account is the inflow and outflow of goods and services, and so that's going to determine whether we have a deficit or a surplus. Those of you paying attention will note that President Trump in the United States is very keen on the balance of trade. The financial account, of course, that includes the money flows between and among countries, includes all financial assets, and including those that are owned by the government. And then the capital account includes international capital transfers. How decisions by consumers and governments and firms affect the balance of payments. All right, you ready for this one? Here's the deal. When a country computes its balance of payments, this is going to affect the exchange rates because that trade surplus or that trade deficit will have an impact on the value of its currency. And so the general conclusion is that countries that have a trade deficit in which their imports exceed the exports will see their currency depreciate. So I worked up a quick example here. Now, you got to bear with me. This is a very, very simple example, and it excludes lots and lots of variables, but I think it illustrates the point. Let's suppose that a U.S. consumer wants to buy some special and fancy ice cubes from Canada. And in Canada, they cost 20 Canadian dollars. Current exchange rate is even, $1 US per Canadian dollar, just to make life simple. Now, here's where I need you to make the leap for me. Let's suppose in the foreign exchange market, there currently is 100 US dollars and 100 Canadian dollars available in the currency markets. And that explains the one-to-one relationship. Supply equals demand, two different supplies, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so this US consumer is going to take $20 out of his or her pocket and convert that to 20 Canadian dollars, right? Then they're going to go to Canada, buy the ice cubes, and then they're going to come back inside of the United States. All right, so what has happened to the foreign exchange market? Now there are only 80 Canadian dollars, and there are now 120 US dollars available in the currency markets. Forget about any other trading out there. This is the only trade. So what happens? There are now more US dollars. There's a greater supply of US dollars in the currency market. And what that means is that the US dollar will depreciate. There's more of a supply of it, so it will lose value as a result of importing ice cubes. Now, of course, what's going to happen is that somebody in Canada is going to look to the United States and say something like, oh, I would like some Milton Hershey chocolate bars. And so they might take 20 Canadian dollars, go to the foreign exchange market, and do just the opposite. Come to Hershey, Pennsylvania, buy the candy, and go back up to Canada. And so the foreign exchange market will then have the original 100 US dollars and 100 Canadian dollars. And that would keep the exchange rate at an even one. And so notice at the top, when there's a trade deficit, there is more importing than there is exporting. Now, of course, the government can intervene to affect the balance of payments, prohibitions on expensive imports, and deflationary fiscal policies. But firms will also impact the balance of payments when they decide to open up a plant here inside the United States or invest globally. How about functions of these organizations like the IMF and the World Trade Organization and the WBG? Well, just remember this. International Monetary Fund is in charge and responsible for lending foreign currencies during periods of crises to promote exchange rate stability and economic stability during those time periods. The World Trade Organization is exactly what the name suggests, trade. So it administers, it oversees, it tries to coordinate trade agreements between and among countries, and then, is kind of like the lawyer involved by resolving the disputes. What it does is to try to improve and increase the transparency of all these trading policies. And the World Bank provides funds for projects in developing countries. And that takes us through this reading. Next up, currency exchange rates.